FM.
Das Kind liegt in Wiegele mit ausgewehnte Augen. Die Mame liegt auf der Erde, die Fies ausgezogen. Nicht so, kein Mame. Nicht so, keine Chome.
Shalom Aleichem, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Avi Hoffman. I'm the founder and CEO of YI, the Yiddishkeit Initiative, and I welcome you to our first major event in our YI Remembers Yom HaShoah, 2 days of events commemorating Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust, and the future of how we continue to bring the legacy of the most horrible event in human history to the world in a positive way. Let's teach awareness. Let's teach acceptance. The song you just heard talked about a mother who is no longer there. But today we are going to be meeting with someone whose mother is still very, very much alive in her heart, in her soul, and most importantly, in her work. So welcome everyone to Czestochowa, a Jewish legacy, with my dear friend and YI board member, Lea Wolinetz. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Czestochowa. Today, Czestochowa is a city in southern Poland with 220,000 plus inhabitants, making it the 13th largest city in Poland. It's the largest economic, cultural, and administrative hub in the northern part of that province. But Czestochowa, which is how we always pronounce the name, is also considered one of the most important European centers of Jewish faith and culture in the long history of the Jewish people. From the early 19th century, Jews played a very important role in the development of industry and commerce in Czestochowa, and a number of Jewish religious, social, educational, and charitable institutions were established. My guest today, Lea Wolinetz, is the executive director of the World Society of Czestochowa Jews and their descendants. And over the years, Lea has been asked many times, repeatedly, why has she given so much of herself to the city of Czestochowa? Her mother, Paula, left Czestochowa so many years ago with such terrible memories, but there were good memories as well, and stories that have to be told and retold about Jewish life in the city that was their home. Her task, like mine, is to always remember to recount the stories of her forefathers as a bequest for the sake of Jewish children and grandchildren everywhere. And as the world loses more Holocaust survivors, it becomes the next generation's mission to pass this legacy on to the world and to celebrate the rich and deep history of the Jewish people. It is now my honor to invite to join me to start her video, Lea Wolinetz. Oh, Shalom Aleichem, Lea, mein Teire. Hello, my dear. So thank you so much for being a part of this first event of our Why I Remembers Yom HaShoah. And before we get into our presentation, because you've prepared this incredible presentation for us. But before we get into it, you and I both share, the fact that we are both children of survivors, and we've both dedicated our lives to this concept of always remembering. And so, can you just, Leah, can
Yeah,
you?
I don't see me here.
That's okay. You don't have to see yourself because I see.
Okay, as long,
Okay?
okay, fine.
So don't sorg sich nicht. I
Yes,
see.
okay.
All right, good. So, can you tell us a little bit about the Czestochowa Society and Relief Committee, when it was created, what it does, and how important it is in maintaining the legacy of our people?
My pleasure. My pleasure. And let me thank you, first of all, you and the Yiddishkeit Initiative and everybody in your staff for creating the most wonderful opportunities for people to learn about the kinds of things that we do that are in our heart. So I thank you in advance for everything that you do. And I'm always happy to talk about the stories that are emboldened in our hearts. The Czestochowa Society, of course, my mother was from Czestochowa, Paula Siegel Horowitz. That Czestochowa Society was started in 1888, which means that there were a lot of people coming through the years from Czestochowa. But one of the pictures that we will be looking at is a book, which is actually, it's amazing that it's still even intact. It shows you the immigration of the group, of how the people came, the waves at the beginning, the 20s, the 30s, and then all of a sudden it stops until the 50s, the beginning of the 50s, and you realize that's when the Holocaust survivors started to come in. So we still exist. We meet together. The Landslide meets together. We talk to each other. A lot of us talk to each other in Yiddish, of course, because we can and we love it. And it's a very beautiful thing. There's Czestochowa societies. There were many. There is still one, and now also in Chicago, and they're still there, and we are in touch. Okay, so it's a wonderful thing.
Right.
Now,
so this is an organization that is worldwide.
Correct.
Czestochowa descendants are all over. How many people would you estimate belong?
It's really hard to know that, Avi, because the Czestochowa Jews, the World Society of Czestochowa Jews, took on the job of putting everything on a website. Right. We had an exhibit that went through the country and the world called The Jews of Czestochowa, right, where we met many people that belonged to us that we had no idea. We have a very, very, very wonderful website, which is
Czestochowajews.org. It's on our screen.
That's right.
So we encourage everyone to go. And this is a great segue to start talking about, all these amazing photographs and documents that you have. So
absolutely.
Can you start telling us a little bit about what we are now looking at?
Yes. Well, of course, obviously the one in the middle is the book that we talked about, 1888. Doesn't look so bad. I'm thinking if I dated back to 1888, I probably wouldn't even look that good. but it's there. And again, the inside is very interesting because of the waves that I mentioned. And the way they filled out the pages were the people's occupation and how many children they were, so that they all kept each other. And because indeed it became what is now, unfortunately, a burial society. However, it's still people there. Okay, so they should only be keep ourselves together. Now, the beautiful synagogue on that left is was, of course, destroyed. The Naya Synagogue, which is the place that my grandparents davened in. As a matter of fact, when Poland was invaded on September 1, 1939, they were in synagogue. because that was the high holidays, which the Germans actually knew. Okay. So it was a very interesting synagogue because it was called the Naya synagogue because they had hired German architects actually to do that. So it was I guess it would be, for us, it was more conservative. There were other religions there in Czestochowa, but this was the certain class that went to this particular one. That was my grandparents, Aaron and Lea Horowitz.
Wow.
Okay. My grandmother was originally from Bialystok, but my grandfather verschleppt her to Czestochowa, and that's where my mom was born, obviously. Now, the other page, the document, is really interesting because one of the things that the Czestochowa Jews did, every 3 years we had a reunion in Czestochowa, which was funded very much by a wonderful mentor who I love and adore, his brother with my mother, girlfriend and boyfriend before the war, Mr. Zygmunt Rolat, and his cousin, Alan Silberstein. They funded all of these. It was great. And one of the things that we did was we went to the archives to look for our things. And I found this document, which was my grandmother and grandfather's wedding announcement in 1919. My mother, they got married in that synagogue. Okay, and for me, it was incredible, better than gold, because at the bottom, you see their signatures. There's Aaron Horowitz and Leah Shemyatitsky. And there are the dates of their birth, which are a little further down, which I have never seen in my life since I have no pictures of them and I have no idea what they look like. And I cried for days because to me, they then became real. The stories, everything I had heard, they were real, okay? And the interesting thing about this, and I'm not sure how I feel about it actually, is my grandfather made my grandmother sign a prenuptial agreement, which was rather interesting. That who would ever figure that was happening in all that time, but he did. As I said, I'm not so sure how I feel about it, but I guess it's something he had to do. They were interesting. I mean, he was an importer and exporter of fine tea, coffee, and my grandmother used to like to see Shakespeare, especially King Lear.
So your grandparents were very much part of the Czestochow intelligentsia, because as I indicated earlier in my introduction, Czestochow was a major center of Jewish life and Jewish culture.
Yeah. My grandfather actually wanted to learn Esperanto. And he threw the books down and said to my mother, too hard, I'm not doing this. And my grandmother only wanted to go to see, she wanted to go see King Lear. And my great grandmother said, Leah, you have to feed your child. And she said, if I don't feed my soul, I can't feed my child. And on that note, the picture in the middle is where they lived. They lived on the Checha Lea number 32. There was a courtyard in there where they lived on the 4th floor. This is very nice neighborhood, very close to Yasna Gora, which is the big monastery, but a very, very fine neighborhood.
You want to tell us very quickly about the monastery, because it's a fascinating story.
Oh, well, Yasna Gora is just an amazing place. It is huge monastery that overshadows the entire town of Czestochowa because of the very famous icon, the Black Madonna, where every church actually in the world has a picture of the Black Madonna. It's a very big, interesting history, very old, and all the people in Czestochowa really, as a matter of fact, I might have told you that my mother and her friends used to go play hooky there because they kind of felt that their parents would never go look for them. But it was a huge, huge influence on the town. And much of the industry was based on that. And if the industry was in Jewish homes, it was based on that. You know, they did lots of things like crosses and and woodwork, a lot of wood. The Polish always do a lot of woodworks.
Which also reinforces for me the idea that the Jews lived in Poland for over 1,000 years, and they lived side by side with the Poles, side by side with the Black Madonna, side by side with everyone. And even in spite of all that, we all know what happened, later in Poland. The photograph you're talking about is the one on the right, yes, where they lived.
The one on the right, yes, where it says Kancelaria.
Yes.
Whatever. Okay, because my mother spoke Polish to me, so I understand Polish. My father spoke Yiddish, but made me speak Yiddish. So my Yiddish is definitely better than my Polish. Okay, but on the left-hand side is a very interesting thing. There's a big black block somehow on the top.
Right.
It was called, and I can't remember, I know that it begins with a P, but I can't remember the name of the clock, but it was a very famous clock in Czestochowa that has now been moved to another place in Czestochowa. But originally it was a place where lovers, dates, in Polish randki, would meet under that clock. And Saturday, the Jewish couples met under there, but Sunday, the Christians did. And that was a very famous thing. And every time my mother saw it, she told me the same story. And in one of our trips to Czestochowa, where I believe my mother went back, she did go to one of the reunions, which was an amazing thing. She pointed out that clock to everybody there. We had hundreds of people and buses, 3 buses, 5 buses. And she pointed that out. She was very proud of that because it was really a part of the world.
Great. So let's move on to the next series of photographs.
Okay, there's my mama after the war. Beautiful, beautiful lady. I purposely posted the thing in the middle because it's her handwriting. It's got a little grease on it, but I think it just shows you it was very important for her because that was her side of the family, my grandmother's side of the family. And the picture in the left was the only picture that I have of my family. And those people in her little diagram talked about the fellow on the left, the tall, very handsome guy. He was my grandmother's brother, Leon. And my mother used to say that he was called the crown of the family because there was 4 sisters and 2 brothers. So there were 6 of them, but he was the oldest and he was always supposed to be like my great grandmother's favorite, but we don't know that. But in this group of family, which is amazing, if you look how beautiful they are and how they had no idea what was about to befall them. It really is, it shows you how life can be. But there is a woman that has an X on it in the middle.
Right here.
Okay, that is Uncle Leon's daughter, Tonya Shemiatitska. And the reason that she is so important is she in the 1930s went to medical school in Padua, Italy. If you can imagine a single Jewish girl going to medical school by herself in Italy. But she stopped off in Czestochowa to see my mother, who was a little girl. And when she got to Italy, she would write letters back. And one of the letters that she wrote was that she got married. She married a Russian guy, and they had 2 children, Mario and Isabella. And the reason that that's so important is because those are the people that brought us to America, Avi. They had moved to the United States, but we didn't know where they were. She didn't know. So my mother wrote a note because she did learn English in school. My mother went to a private school. So she wrote, to any Jewish organization, help me. I have a cousin, Tonya, and I don't know her husband's name, and I don't know where she is. And of course, 6 weeks later, Haya sent her back a letter saying, we found your cousin Tonya. She's in Albany with her husband, with Mario and Isabella, with the two children that had odd names for Jewish children. And they were the ones that brought us here to America. So that's why I point that out. And it's the only picture that I have of my relatives at all.
You and I talked about the other day about how most of the people on this list that we're looking at are in this photograph, and how many of them survived the war.
4.
Right. And that is, of course, the enormous tragedy of our world and our lives, and why it's so important for us to remember these people. I'm moving on. Lea, tell us.
Okie dokie, here we go. There's my mom really after the war, okay? And so this jumps to when my father went to Czestochowa to look for his family or for somebody that he survived with in Buchenwald. And he came to Czestochowa looking for, he didn't exactly know who, but somebody on the street mentioned to him that there were 5 good-looking girls down the block, and maybe he should try to see if that's somebody he knew. And my mother would say, and my luck, I was the only one who was the only one home, and I opened the door, and they were married 4 weeks later. So you can see that. They used to love to take walks in the snow, my mother and father. And the picture in the middle, my mother is pregnant with me, okay, because these are taken in Bad Vereshof in Germany, where they arrived after many travails along the way after leaving Czestochowa in 1945, through Italy, Vienna, and then they ended up in Germany, which was where a lot of survivors went, because it was the exit to either Canada, the United States, or then Palestine.
Right. I mean, what I love about these kinds of pictures is that we see the life that they led. It was normal. You know, people think of the Holocaust and the war and before the war, and it was so, there's all these myths and legends, Shtetlach and Schmetlach. But the bottom line is there were people living in big cities and big towns, living a normal life, side by side with everybody, having a wonderful time, doing what they did, import, export, business. The Jews were such an integral part of Polish culture until they weren't.
Until they were.
Let me move on.
Yes, absolutely. I think my mother actually, the people in the corner, they all got married about the same time. I think my mother even bought my father a motorcycle so that he could be happy. They were so happy to be alive, and there was hope for the future. And that is what they instilled in us, in me, all of my life, and that there is always hope and always look to the future. And no matter what, you have to look at the bright side of things, never forget, but okay, those are some of my mother's friends in the corner. I love her shoes. I love her shoes because I'm a shoe nut, so I love my mother's shoes. This is the lading list, I suppose, of the ship that we came on, which Tonya and her husband provided everything. And you can see our names on the list. You see Ziegel with a Z. Why? Because that's how my father spelled it. But when my mother came to America, she changed the Z to a Y and the S to an I because she didn't want me to be last in school. So therefore, Siegel is spelled incorrectly, but she didn't win anyway because they married a Wolinetz, and that's W. Okay, so that's it. But the reason that's so important is that it was the Marina Tiger was the name of the ship. And one of the stories that my mother told was when she first came and she saw the Statue of Liberty. And she said to him, I lost everything. And all of this loneliness, I see all of those lights in New York Harbor. I don't speak the language. Where are they going? What am I going to do? My child's in my arms. We have no place to stay. I want to know what's happening, but she spoke in Polish. And years later, she had a good friend who took her back to the Statue of Liberty. And she said, now, Paula, you can tell the Statue of Liberty how everything worked out for you. Lea is fine, your husband is fine. And she said, and Lea, I spoke to her in English. So I love that story, and I always recount that. Now, when we got to Albany, the picture in the middle, Tonya, there was a brother-in-law who was a famous photographer. So I kind of put that picture in because I just love it. And it's so cute.
And who is that? Who is that a picture of?
I don't know. I wouldn't have any idea. I don't know, but she's awfully cute.
Well, but I know and you know, but the audience doesn't know, so you have to tell us.
It's me.
There you go. Our beautiful Lea. Look at that. Gorgeous, gorgeous child.
Anyway, so the picture on the left-hand side, I purposely posted because that was already when they got settled in the Bronx. And we lived on Fale Street in the Hunts Point section of the Bronx. And our apartment became a place where all the newcomers came and everybody helped each other. There were parties all the time because who else could have understood their experience except for them? And each one of them had helping hands to each other. There are people in this picture that I am still friendly with their children. I remember all those people's names. One of them is actually a cousin. And my girlfriend Harriet's parents, Harriet Partel Schleifer, her parents. We were always people in our house, always. It didn't matter if there was room or not. Always the helping hand to each other, to the grino. My mother did not like that expression. She said only people who were displaced persons. She was, but they always helped each other. That was the point. That was my point.
And I remember when I was growing up in the Bronx, the Holocaust survivors always got together. And even though the non-greenhorns didn't want to really talk about it, and they really didn't want to deal with it, and the groups of survivors got together and worked with each other and helped each other and built an incredible society together. And that was amazing.
I always tell the story that there were many of the survivors that became very wealthy. And one of them arrives at my parents' apartment and he says, you have room in your refrigerator? My mother said, for what? He said, I brought you a quarter of a cow. What am I going to do with a quarter of a cow? So he says, I don't know. And I think he drove it over in his Lincoln Continental. But the point is they were there for each other. They were there for each other. Yeah.
Sure. So Lea, just tell us, because again, you and I know these things, but in this photograph on the bottom left, yes, how many of them were actual survivors of the Holocaust?
All of them.
There you go.
All of them. And then what was interesting is a little later, my parents sort of became the foster parents to a lot of Hungarian Jews, because the Hungarian Jews came, they didn't have parents, and my parents were young, but they came with their future wives to ask my parents for permission, because they were sort of settled. And I remember them as a little girl. There was Miklos, and I just remember them. But so even then, they were not Polish, but they helped each other. They were there. I remember that so vividly, that they came to ask my parents for their blessing. My parents were very old.
It just so happens that my father, who survived Auschwitz, was a Hungarian Jew whose name was Miklos.
Miklos, see? I always remember that name. I remember if there were 100 people, I would pick him right out now. He was good looking. Okay. So I posted these pictures because I love their hair. And I love the way they were so happy. This was the time to start having bar mitzvahs. And they were just so beautiful. And who to think that they went through a Holocaust? Of course they did, but look at them. They were so happy to be alive. The hope for the future was so important. I look at my mother in that yellow dress. I don't know what she had down there, feathers or something, but this was wonderful. And I'm sure that most of the people that I know, my survivors, have pictures just like this, because that's what they did. It was unbelievable that they got to this point when they could think all of that time before that they were laying in the dirt in Hassag, in Bergen-Belsen, and wherever they were laying, and that they could get to this point. Fabulous. So I wanted to give them that honor. Proud of them that they did that.
Well, and I think you're right, because one of the things that I know my parents celebrated and all of their friends were celebrating was this idea that we beat Hitler. We won. We lost so many, but we survived.
Exactly.
And you and I, the children, that was the torch that was now going to show the world that Hitler did not succeed in destroying the Jewish people. And we became, life became about the children and creating business and succeeding and becoming part of society and contributing to society. And you're right, many of the Holocaust survivors ended up becoming some of the biggest philanthropists in America. Tell us about this letter that's on the upper right.
Oh, the letter is when I started teaching, and I started to travel to Europe and other places. I arrived. I don't even know if they make these anymore, but these are aerograms where my mother wrote the letter, and you can see the address, Mr. and Mrs. David Siegel. And that was when we moved. We moved to the big time. We moved to Marshall Parkway. That was Gates Place. That was big time from Hunts Point. When I arrived in Florence, Italy, to the American Express, which is where we had to go to get our money, because that's where my parents sent the money, I arrived in the American Express office in Florence, and the gentleman, I tell him my name is Lea Siegel, and he says, "Oh, signorina, I'm so happy to see you." I said, "What? Do I know you?" He says, "I don't know you, but the letter S mailbox must have 500 letters in there, and we have no more room for anybody else with an S." And that was because my mother wrote me a letter every day from Europe. And my American girlfriend, Linda, may she rest in peace, said, "Nobody sent me anything. Your mother sent you so much. Your mother sent me." But I did it because I have so many of those letters. And the interesting thing is of now, it's a history of what happened through the years. It was amazing, really amazing letters that she wrote so beautifully. Her English was wonderful, really amazing. But that was like a story of mine that I love and adore. So I wanted to share that with your audience.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you're going to read one of these letters a little later, aren't you?
Well, not that letter, but we could do a lot of other letters. That's a whole other thing. It's a whole box full of letters. It's a whole box. I thank you. They're really interesting only because it tells you the history.
Yeah. All right, moving on. Tell us about these beautiful people.
Yeah. This is my mother and father at their 50th wedding anniversary. And there's a good friend of theirs behind them. And my children were all at their wedding. My daughter was the bridesmaid. Yes, she was a bridesmaid. My little son, who was born much later than the other big ones, was the ring bearer, and my son was the best man. So that wedding was a very, very important thing for them because it was 50 years and 50 years after the Holocaust. 50 years. My father was very dapper, wasn't he? My father was a dapper guy. Oh my. He said he used to take the garbage out in his suit. He said, "You never know who you're going to meet, and nobody has to know that I don't have a lot of money. I have to look good." That's it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. And who are these beautiful people?
Oh, they were beautiful people and wonderful people. That's a very old picture of the family. My husband, Alan, my son, Alex, my daughter, Andrea, Jeffrey, my mother and father. And that I think was at Jeffrey's bar mitzvah, because that you see, Alex was so teeny. He was such a little guy, but that, and my husband was so young. Oh, and he's handsome too. Okay. And that's another picture. That's my son's bar mitzvah, actually. The theme of his bar mitzvah was Jews in Japan. And all the tables were like Pokemon and all of those kinds of Japanese anime things. And you see all the Holocaust survivors walking around with the thing saying, "What is this Pokemon? What is this? What is this?" So it was great. It was great. That was my wedding with my daddy. And then my picture with my mommy in our house here in Rockland County, where they lived with us for a long time until they both passed. Because it was really important for my children to know the grandparents, something I never had. And although it wasn't always easy to have teenage kids, babies, aging parents, it was most important for my children to know their grandparents, the privilege that I never had.
I think it's important that we mention the idea that these are your personal photographs.
Yes.
But every single one of us, every single one of the children of survivors, many of the grandchildren of survivors, now have these exact same photographs, but with different people in them, which really brings me to the idea of what we're talking about, which is the legacy of life, not the legacy of death.
Absolutely.
We all know about the death already. We've heard the stories, and we have to teach it and we have to talk about it. But the real legacy that I think you and I leave to the world, thankfully, is this idea of life. And look at the lives we've created, and look at the lives that we've established. And everybody has these kinds of photographs. Is there anything else about these that you want to share with us?
No, I mean, other than you're 100% right. I'm as interested in how the family and the people lived as how they died. We know how they died. I couldn't bring them back. My mother couldn't bring them. Nobody could bring them back. It's what happened. And we all have to live in our lives with what we have. And what I have is, I'm a very rich lady, Avi. I'm a very rich lady. Past this are 4 grandchildren, which they never saw. My grandchildren, my beautiful grandchildren, my beautiful small family, because I'm an only child. So there are no brothers and sisters, which made life even more difficult because there were no aunts and no uncles and no first cousins and nothing. So all of our survivor friends, we call each other aunt and uncle, Tante Mary. That's because that's what it was. So it made it even more difficult. Oh, there I am. Yep. There's one little story that I wanted to just tell you quickly that happened. And one of the things my mother was most proud of was I started an adoption program here in 1997, where we brought older children from Russia at that time. And we had a family come to us, and his last name was Taubert. And I said to him, Taubert, you're German. I mean, his wife's name was Heidi, so there wasn't kind of doubt of that. But to make a long, long story short, he adopted through me, but his uncle was the commandant in both my parents' concentration camp, my father in Skalzhisko Kamyena and my mother in Hasag. And I know stories about them personally. So they actually wrote a story together. But it was one of the things my mother was so proud of. I said, for everything that happened for a reason, and this family adopted children. And so it was an amazing coincidence.
One of the things I love about the work that we're doing together, and this is a perfect example, is the idea that as we, the second generation, we are called 2Gs, right? So as the two G's have grown up, have gotten a little older, many of us who are in the arts have been finding ways to express our stories and our desire to express ourselves in a way that is artistic and ends up teaching people. For instance, the great Broadway play with music, Indecent. This was an amazing production on Broadway. The director got a Tony Award, Rebecca Teichman. But the idea that these are people, Paula Vogel wrote it based on reminiscences, and Sholem Ash, the great playwright who wrote The God of Vengeance in 1907, I think he wrote it. But she adapted it to a more modern, contemporary way that became a big hit on Broadway just a few years ago. And I think as we continue into not only the two G's, but now into the three G's,
The four G's too now.
four G's and the five G's eventually, we're going to find more and more ways to bring life to this experience of death. And that to me is an extraordinary responsibility, but also a great blessing.
But I accept that responsibility with all the love that I was shown in my life. And I accept it as, there are a lot of people who can't accept it, Avi, a lot of people who can't. I choose to give what I got.
Right.
And that's the way I see it.
Yeah.
Always.
And we're very proud to have you as our friend, our associate, a board member, and a sponsor with the Czestochowa Society, which is such
My pleasure.
part.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So tell us, I know you wanted to share something with us.
Yes.
Now is the time,
Okay.
as we start to bring our event to an ending. We're doing so many different events today and tomorrow, and I'm so proud that you could be our first event of this season.
Thank you.
What else do you want to share with us?
Well, I want to share something with you because all of us, I want to just tell everybody to keep telling the stories. I mean, that is for me what is going to keep them alive. It's now what keeps my parents alive. And I'm so thankful that my mother wrote a lot of those things. She did write things. And I just want to know that the next generation is passed through all of those things, through those stories. And this letter that I'm about to read to you is something that my mother, Paula, wrote to her mother, Lea. It's kind of personal, but I feel that you need to all know this. So I think it'll be a nice way to close as my gift to Avi and whoever is listening about how much the survivors, what really went on in their lives, the simple things that they missed, the very simple things, the things that we don't think about, or just as everyday, everything, nothing, the way it's supposed to be. Those things were very important with a touch of survivor's guilt. Okay. So I'm going to read it now.
I'm going to stop my video so you can have the screen all by yourself.
Oh, thank you, Avala. Should I begin now?
Yes, you can.
Okay. To my mother, Lea, I remember the day we walked the desecrated, violated streets in our city of Czestochowa, occupied by the German boot. And we knew that we were parting forever. I held you under my arms, pressed to your shaking body. I saw you trembling eyelids, and I pressed to your shaking body, tears running down your cheeks. And you said, facing me, "So you are leaving? I cannot believe." This was at the point of the selection where they went left or right. And my mother said, "I must go. My destiny is calling me, Mommy." And destiny it was. It led me toward life, and you to an untimely death. It did not seem that way at first. We thought yours was the safe road and mine was the dangerous road. But I ask myself every day, did I fail you? Did I betray you in my absence? If I would have gone just one more to the left, not to the right, would it have changed something? Would I have been of any help? There is so much to regret and so much to be sorry for. You have never been in my home. I never cooked a meal for you. You never met my husband. You never saw me grow up. But it's most regrettable that you never saw her, your granddaughter. You will never see her. That happiness that you deserved, it was torn away from you by the cold-blooded killers. But your message, and this is in Polish, called Głowa do góra, should be so happy that I say that right, will always be with us. And your granddaughter will always carry your name with pride and love. I miss you always, your daughter Paula.
Now you have to tell us what Głowa do góra means.
It means keep your head up high, no matter what happens to you. Głowa is head, the góra is up. No matter what happens to you, that is what you have to do. And I think of that all the time. There's not one day that I don't think about my mother. She's always with me. She's always with me in one way or the other. And I think by telling the stories, she is still here. So I will love her to the last of my days. And I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my story.
Please, I'm the one who is grateful to you. I'm very honored. Głowa do góra, right?
Głowa do góra.
And you know, you said something earlier before I let you go that really struck deep. You said, I am very rich. But you weren't talking about money. We're talking about being so incredibly rich that we have this experience and these memories and these stories within us that we can share with the world. And that's one of the themes of this entire 2-day commemoration, because almost every single element of what we are doing today and tomorrow in the Why I Remembers Yom HaShoah is all about how rich we are, how lucky we are to actually be part of the Holocaust legacy. You know, my father never talked about it. He came out of Auschwitz. He never talked about it until much, much later. Yet Holocaust was a part of our upbringing. We knew what happened. We were taught what happened. We sang the songs in Yiddish. Nit kein Malaz du gehst dem letzten Weg. Never say that this is the last road. No matter how terrible things might be, no matter how awful everything looks, tomorrow will be a better day. Hold your head up high.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And songs, music in my house, wie hin soll gehen.
Sure.
Wer kann für mir, wie hin soll gehen. So verschlossen jeden Tier.
Yeah.
That. And he always used to like to sing also, was given is given, shine still.
That's right. What was and is no longer.
It's not going to be anymore. But they also had, wonderful other songs. Songs were always an important part of for my mother, this was very, if you have a couple of minutes, 1 second, I just want to tell you a funny story.
Absolutely.
My mother did not speak Yiddish at home. She spoke Polish, Russian, Latin. She never spoke Yiddish. I suppose in her house, Yiddish was the broken, the hidden language, which is so many of the cases that people don't do that. My father hardly spoke Polish because he came from a little shtetl outside of Warsaw, Stara Praga, but it was the Wurka Rebbe, which was a big guy. he only spoke Yiddish. His Polish was abominable. And my mother reminded him of that every single day of his life because she read Pantadeusz, and he was thrown out of his house at 10
Hmm.
to walk the streets of Warsaw to get a job. But my mother always, so my children said to her, Grandma, I don't understand. If he didn't speak Polish and you didn't speak Yiddish, how did you communicate? So my mother, with her cigarette in her hand and her book, would say, my darling children, who told you that we communicate? Very sharp wit, my mom.
Very
Very
sharp.
sharp wit.
And we are very lucky to have her through you. And so thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And I get, is there more that we should talk about?
Well, no, I just want to once again just thank you, Lea Wolinetz, for being part of our incredible 2-day commemoration of Yom HaShoah and bringing us the Jewish legacy, the living legacy of Czestochowa. And of course, the Czestochowa Society is one of our sponsors. And you, I'm very proud to say, are on our board of directors. And we're very honored to have you.
My pleasure. My pleasure, because I told you, I think once at the beginning of our relationship, and I said to you, I was made for this. I've been waiting for this for, I'm not going to tell you how many years, but this is what I do. I make the connections. I bring the life to you. I bring life, and that's my pleasure. Some Zame gesinnten stark,
Dank. I'm going to stop your video, and
Sure.
then I will tell our viewers exactly what we are continuing to do for the rest of today and tomorrow. So, ladies and gentlemen, Nachamul, that was Lea Wolinetz, Czestochowa, A Jewish Legacy. And what a fascinating story. But these are stories that are shared by so many different people. So at 5 p.m. today, it's going to be a real treat because it's going to be a live performance. I'm actually going to be performing live a play by my dear friend, an extraordinary playwright, actress, Tony Award nominated director. And yesterday we spoke about these things in one of my schmoozes, Eleanor Risa, who wrote a short play called The Last One, an Epilogue, which imagines what happens when we reach the last of the Mohicans, the last of the survivors, and what will they have to say to us? And then we will discuss it. So that's at 5 o'clock live on our YouTube and our Facebook. You can go to our website if you can't figure it out, Why I Love Jewish, view events at 7 p.m. tonight. As I said, we're featuring Eleanor Risa, this incredibly talented woman and someone I'm very honored to call my friend, who wrote another play called The Last Survivor. And so we have a full cast of Broadway actors. It's an extraordinary piece, and we will be presenting that at 7 p.m. And then at 9 o'clock tonight, we are going to have a panel discussion with several very significant members of the community. And the panel discussion is on the subject, After the Last Survivor, the future of Holocaust awareness. What do we do after the last survivor? So Eleanor Risa will be there representing her work. Dr. Yael Danieli, who has been at the United Nations working with refugees. She created centers for trauma, children of survivors, descendants, working with trauma victims from all over the world. She is an extraordinary woman and a dear friend of mine. Stephen Lutzen, who was on the original commission. He was appointed by Jimmy Carter to the original committee and board of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We have Lea Wolinetz is going to join us again, so she can bring her perspective as one of the leaders of the 2G community. And we have a woman who is a leader of the 3G community, Stacy Seance, who is on the board of trustees of both the Holocaust Museum in Washington and the Museum of Jewish Heritage in Manhattan. So that's tonight at 9 o'clock. Tomorrow we have a full slate starting at 2 p.m. with Chess Masters to the Holocaust and Beyond, David Friedman's Art Legacy with his daughter Miriam Friedman. It's amazing, all this looted art and lost art that Miriam, has found of her father's, and telling the story of her father's artwork, especially in light of the fact that he created many of the billboards that you all know as the Budweiser, the horses, and the Clydesdales, and all that. And so that is a fascinating interview at 2 p.m. At 5 p.m., we are going to have a conversation with Rabbi Rosalie Jarrett, who is the founder of an organization called onebyone.org, and they bring together children of survivors with children of perpetrators, children of the survivors of the Holocaust with children of the Nazis who perpetrated the Holocaust. That's how it started, and now it deals with children of trauma from all over the world with the perpetrators, bringing people together one by one. At 6:30 tomorrow evening, Professor Robert Watson, an award-winning author, professor, best-selling author, is doing a lecture on Theresen, the model camp, or Theresen, as we pronounced it, the model camp. And that's in anticipation of our huge musical presentation of a musical drama called Signs of Life, which is based on the Theresen internment camp. And it's going to have, again, performers from all over the country, some wonderful talent, helping us to bring these stories to life. And at 9 p.m. tomorrow, we will be meeting the creators of Signs of Life, Peter Julian, Len Schiff, Joel Durfner, Joan Lyman, the producers, and Virginia Chris, and the director of the reading, our very own Amy London. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this particular presentation, and I invite you to please come and join our programs for the next 2 days. Go to our website, yilovejewish.org, click on the events, and you will see all the amazing things that we are bringing to you. All of our events are free to the public, and so if you like what we're doing, please consider supporting our organization on our website, and I will see you later at 5 o'clock. Ashenim und herzlichen Dank.